So if the first two books clicked with you, this may become your favorite Malazan book. So today, it's the third book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erikson. I've got to admit, doing Malazan reviews makes me nervous. These are such good books. I want to do them justice, so I'll do my best. Get the basics out of the way first. This is the book. It was published in 2006 by Tor. This particular edition has 925 pages, bigger than either of the first two books. And I should warn you that if you haven't read this or the two previous books, there will be spoilers, not for this one, but for the previous two. I will talk freely about them and not be careful. This one, I will not be spoiling anything, so you've been warned. If you've ever seen any of my reviews, you know what comes next. What's it got? A return to Genabacchus. Many of the characters we loved in Gardens of the Moon. Quite a few new characters, of course. Bridge burners. An army of cannibals. Sorcerous giant condors. Undead dinosaurs with swords for hands. Did you hear that? Undead dinosaurs with swords for hands. More detail on the magic system. More info on the deck of dragons. Crop. Petty priests. Crazy godshit. Extremely badass mask-wearing super swordsman. Character death. And Kleenex moments. If you're curious about the series, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, go check out my review of Gardens of the Moon. That's the first book. That's the book you should start with. And you probably shouldn't be watching this. But I mentioned in that video that it's a series that's definitely not for everyone. And I consider this book, Memories of Ice, I've done my best tap out point. Some people will just not get along with the prose or how confusing some things can be, and they might already tap out in Gardens of the Moon. But if you're committed to giving Malazan a fair go, you should continue until Memories of Ice at least. I think if you've read the first three books and you really aren't enjoying it, it really doesn't feel like it's for you, then it's definitely not for you. But I've known people who were not that into Gardens of the Moon, and Dead House Gates maybe was difficult and they didn't deal with the change of characters and change of place and all of that sort of stuff very well. And then Memories of Ice, you get back to your characters that you loved from Gardens of the Moon. You go back to a place that you already became familiar with in Gardens of the Moon. This is a typical Eriksonian thing. It happens throughout the entire series. You spend a whole book with characters in a place. You learn a lot of new things. You learn to love or hate the new characters. And then the next book starts and it's totally somewhere else. And sometimes it's very extreme, where you don't have anything from the previous book to start with. In this one, we get one of those cases where we actually get to go back. So if you liked Gardens of the Moon and the characters in it, most of them are also in Memories of Ice. So that's good to know. So if you see my previous Malazan videos, you know that I'm doing a Malaz Everything read. And right now, this is my favorite book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And that's recency bias, obviously. But I also remember the first time I read the entire 10-book series, I remember thinking back on it, and I'm very bad about tier ranking things. I don't like trying to compare them, and it seems kind of meaningless to me. And I don't really give star reviews either, sorry. But at least one thing I could rank and just say Memories of Ice was my favorite. So far, certainly on the reread, it's only the third book, but it's still my favorite. It's a little above Dead House Gates, and it's pretty epic. So what's going on in Memories of Ice? Well, the first thing to say is there is a prologue to the book, which is really important. But also, if this is your first read, it's pretty hard to understand. So my advice is read the prologue twice. Not necessarily read it and then read it again, but read it and maybe read some of the book or all of the book and then go back and read it again, because it will mean more to you after you've understood more and you've run into certain characters in the book and that kind of thing. You could reread it, or maybe just read it carefully and maybe slowly at the beginning. I remember when I first read it, I don't think I understood what was going on really in the prologue at all. And I didn't go back and reread it. I kind of promptly forgot about it. And I kind of wish I'd reread it, or read it more carefully, or understood it at least better, tried maybe a little harder to understand it better. Because there are very important things going on in the prologue. It will not ruin the story for you if you don't understand the prologue. In fact, you could completely skip the prologue and just go straight into the story, and it would be totally fine. But I really think there's value in getting some of what's going on in the prologue. It makes a lot of relationships later in the book a little bit more understandable and clearer what certain people's motivations are. Maybe after 2 books, you're used to it, but I'll just mention it again. In the Malazan Book of the Fallen, almost every book is a big shift. You land in a new place, you get a bunch of new characters, maybe the old characters that you're used to are not there anymore. It happens pretty much in every book, and it's just part of what the Malazan Book of the Fallen is. One of the cool things about this one, though, is that we are in a totally different place than we were in the last book, but we're back to the place we were in the first book. So Gardens of the Moon and this book, Memories of Ice, are in Genabacchus. So the structure of pretty much every Malazan or Erikson Malazan novel is a bunch of people all over the place, and they all come together at the end. And he talks about this, and I think it's also clearly sort of mentioned in Gardens of the Moon. It's the idea of convergence. So first of all, power draws power. So wherever there is a quite large concentration of power in one place, more power, more powerful people will come to that place. And the convergence in this is pretty massive, because we've got a lot of ascendants in play. So these sort of somewhat godlike people who used to be normal mortals like everyone else. And the structure of this particular book is a bunch of people getting together for a battle, going to the battle. There is a big battle in sort of the middle of the book, and then they have another goal, and it's going to another battle. That is, in very broad strokes, essentially the story of this novel. Of course, with all of Erikson's books, or at least the Malazan books that I've read, the characters, the relationships between the characters, the things that happen to the characters is really the point. The big story is a structure that the characters move in, but the characters themselves and their movements are really what touch you, move you, maybe piss you off. But that's the real point of the story, is the characters. So it's going to a battle and then going to another battle. That's basically it. What's the battle about? It's mentioned late in Gardens of the Moon that some threat is rising in the south of Genabacchus. So we're back in Genabacchus for this book. And the awesome thing about that is it's a return to a lot of our favorite characters. So most of the bridge burners are in this book. The Taistandi and Amanda Rake, all of them are in this book. Moonspawn is in this book. There are a lot of things that we left behind in Gardens of the Moon. Had to sort of get through one more novel, and now we're sort of back. And in Gardens of the Moon, there was a lot of fighting going on, and mostly it was the Malazans, bridge burners, and Dujek's host against Caladan Brood and his army, Anamander Rake, and all of the Taistandi, and the Rivi, who are a Genebakan native tribe. All of them were fighting together against the Malazan invasion, essentially. The threat that is rising in the south is the Panian Domin, and it is a fanatical, religious, I guess you could almost call it empire, but it's not really. It's portrayed a little bit like a plague, really. A lot of people are converting, and when they convert, they kind of go crazy. It's pretty fanatical, and they are seen as such a large threat that Caladan Brood and Anamander Rake and the Rivi get together with the Malazans to combat it. They agree to an alliance to stop fighting each other because what's going on with the Panian Domin is so threatening and so, frankly, horrible. I mentioned a cannibal army. That's the Panian Domin's army. So there's this big enemies to allies thing going on with the story. There's also a very large thing with the Talana Mass. In Gardens of the Moon, if I remember correctly, we met basically one. Onas Tulan, or Tool, was the only real Talana Mass that we spent much time with. In this one, all of the Talana Mass, I won't go into why, but all of the Talana Mass have been called to Genebakas. And they're all coming from wherever they are to take part in something. I won't get into it. And that's a really big part of the story as well. The other thing, and this is a bunch of totally new characters, is the Grey Swords. The Grey Swords are also an interesting group. They are a mercenary cult. So they're mercenaries, but they're also a religious order. And we get a lot more of a look into the structures of religion, the structures of maybe a church. There are also a whole bunch of priests in one of the cities, and we get a little bit of a glimpse of what they're like. The Grey Swords are interesting because they are priests and acolytes of Fenner, the boar god, who played a pretty big role in Dead House Gates with Habarik. So when they escape from the Otadral mines and they call down Fenner, the boar god, that, a whole book ago, has a really big impact on the Grey Swords, who are all religious soldiers who are sworn to Fenner. The themes in this book are, of course, continuing a lot of the themes that we've had in the other books. One big one that is maybe focused on a little bit more in this one is death as a transformation, death not as the end. This is a criticism that a lot of people have leveled at Erikson and at this series, which I personally don't agree with, saying that death doesn't mean anything, or that death is cheap, or that when people die, they don't stay dead. That part is generally true. There are some people who die and just go away, but a lot of people, a lot of characters that we care about do die, and they do come back, but they always come back completely changed. They come back in some way extremely different than they were. And this book is where it really starts very concretely, where there are a number of characters who die or almost die, and they end up being completely different people. They don't go away. They don't go through Hood's Gate and stay there, but they are greatly, greatly changed, transformed by dying. And this is just a fact of the Malazan world. Yeah, I don't think you need to make any kind of judgments about Erikson or whatever. Maybe it's something you don't like. Okay. But it's a fact of the Malazan world. A lot of people do die because it's a very violent world. But death does not mean the same thing in this fantasy world as it does in our real world. Sometimes people die and they do not come back. And often people die and they come back almost a new person. One of the big ongoing themes is sacrifice. There are a lot of points in this book where someone willingly or unwillingly does something very difficult or gives up something very valuable for the benefit of someone else. And this is seen from a lot of different perspectives. As I said, there's one particular example of it that's pretty extreme, of someone who is more or less losing their life in order for someone else to live. And it's unwilling. They did not choose it. And then there's another example of someone who very, very happily, I don't know about happily, but very willingly gives up their own life for many other people to benefit. So sacrifice is an ongoing theme through the whole series. Compassion, often if you ask someone what is the Malazan Book of the Fallen about, they'll say compassion. And that is a useless answer. It's not incorrect, but it doesn't really tell you anything. But as a theme, compassion is a very big deal in the series. That is absolutely correct. And in this particular book is the most commonly cited example of compassion. When I can talk later about spoilers, I will get into that. I think that's actually not one of the better examples. That particular one that's always quoted over and over again. But there is a lot going on with compassion where someone, even to their own detriment, gives up something valuable for the benefit of others, purely out of love for them or purely out of compassion. I've been thinking about plans for Malazan content. I think if you've read this far, and if this video has convinced you to read this book, you're probably either going to give up after that or you're going to keep going. I don't need to convince you to read the 4th book and the 5th book and the 8th book. I don't know how useful reviews are as a series continues. So I'm actually thinking I might stop doing Malazan reviews. I'm going to continue my Malazan read/read. I'm going to be doing a Malazan book and another book and Malazan book and another book ongoing until I've finished all the Malazan books, which is 26 or 7. Not the main series, that's only 10. But I want to read all of the Malazan books by Stephen Erikson and Ian C. Esselmont. And that's a lot of books. But just to read this series, I think for the Malazan Book of the Fallen, I'm going to stop the reviews here. And I've been thinking I might start doing more spoiler content. So something you wouldn't necessarily want to watch until you've read at least a few of the Malazan books, and getting more into the characters and the themes and things that I can't really talk about that easily in a review like this. Let me know what you think of that. I'm not sure if that's just an idea I have or whether you would agree with that, but I think reviews ongoing for the rest of the Malazan Book of the Fallen don't make sense. I don't know. So let's talk about the cover briefly. Honestly, I don't have that much to say about the cover. It's following the formula of the previous 2 covers. The illustration is by Steve Stone, just like the first 2. In fact, I think all of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, the covers are painted by Steve Stone. The typography is exactly the same as the previous 2. The little decorative bits that I mentioned in the other videos, they're also there. The thing about this cover that kind of bothers me maybe more than the previous ones is I guess this was printed after the series had found a little bit of success, and Stephen Erikson was a slightly better known name, which it maybe wasn't at the beginning of the series. So now it's got New York Times bestselling author. Down the bottom, like the previous ones, it's got a tale of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Still no number, no idea that this is the third book. And it's got a quote on the cover from Publishers Weekly. The thing about this isn't by any means a hard and fast design rule. But when I'm working with typography, when I'm designing something, I generally try to keep the differences in typography that are on one thing down to 3 as a rule of thumb, not a hard and fast rule. But if you get too much different typography on one piece of something, it starts feeling very busy and maybe unbalanced and confusing even. So what we've got here is we've got one size of typography in yellow. We've got italic and not italic, another different size, same typeface. We've got the title in another different typeface, in another size. We've got another smaller typeface, which is italic and not italic and bold and not bold. And we've got down the very bottom, another size of typography in the same typeface as the stuff up the top. That's a lot of differences, and this feels really busy to me. And the placement of everything, it's all centered except for this one quote, which has enough visual weight that it kind of seems to throw the whole thing a little bit off balance. So it seems like a bit of a jumble of typography for me. It's just a bit busy. It could have been maybe a little lighter on the secondary details, like the quote and the New York Times bestselling author. The other thing is, I don't know what this illustration is telling me. It's obviously saying that there is some fighting and fire, but the guy in armor with the shield and the axe could be almost anyone. In fact, I can't off the top of my head think of specifically who it might be. His face is mostly covered, and he doesn't really have any distinguishing, unique characteristics. It's a return to the style of a lot of the covers, which are black with a little splash of color and one figure. It's not all of them in the entire series, but it is the majority of them. And I don't know. I'm giving it a GFC, Generic Fantasy Cover Award. It just doesn't do much for me. And it doesn't tell me much about the book, except that it's probably violent and people have axes. And overall, it just feels very, very busy. It's not a cover that stands out in any kind of special way. So if you've made it this far in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, I hope that you continue. I hope that this video has piqued your interest. If you've got any questions about this book, leave them down in the comments. I'd love to hear them and I can try and answer them. And as always, keep reading awesome books, and I'll see you next time.